Welcome everyone to the launch webinar of our handbook on how to use national MPIs as a policy tool from metrics to policy. This is a collaborative report by the UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, and the Oxford Policy, Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, authored by one of our speakers today, Gonzalo Hernandez Licona. I'm delighted to join you today to moderate this fascinating, important discussion, highlighting the innovative strategies for integrating the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which captures multiple deprivations and vulnerabilities beyond monetary measures across health, education, living standards. And it can provide governments and policymakers with a roadmap to address poverty in all its dimensions. The handbook, which is available to you online, comes at a particularly important time. Globally, 1.1 billion are living in acute multidimensional poverty across 112 countries. Countries worldwide are striving to achieve the 2030 Agenda and advance poverty and inequality reduction strategies due to a rise in conflict, geopolitical tensions, economic uncertainties, climate, environmental risks. We need action and we need results now. At the moment, we have more than 40 countries that have developed their own national MPIs. Actually, it's my pleasure to have worked in at least a couple of these countries with Sabina, so I'm particularly happy to hear the discussions today. Many have been developed in close collaboration with UNDP and OPHI. We've also worked with governments to use the MPI to identify country-specific and sub-national priorities, to design targeted policies towards marginalized and vulnerable population groups, and to guide efficient resource allocation, and then to track progress towards reducing multidimensional poverty and inequalities. So, for instance, some of the practical examples include Colombia. Colombia has used its national MPI to prioritize regions and municipalities with high levels of multidimensional poverty to assign social protection beneficiaries. And then in Chile, Chile has used the social household register based on its national MPI to identify more than 25,000 children who've not attended school and to design effectively targeted programs for school enrollment. And then in Bhutan, the first Asian country to adopt the MPI in 2010, it uses it as a key criterion for budget allocation, leading to more effective poverty reduction and a significant decline in multidimensional poverty. We will hear more about these and other examples and insights today from our experts on the panel. So let me now take this opportunity to introduce you to our panel. Firstly, Mr. Gonzalo Hernandez Licona, formerly with the government of Mexico as the Executive Secretary of the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development Policy, CONEVAL. Gonzalo is currently the Director of the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, MPPN, at OPHI, responsible for strategic direction of the activities of the South-South Network across 60 countries on how to measure multidimensional poverty. It's great to have you here, Gonzalo. And then it's also my pleasure to welcome Sabina Alkaya, who needs no introduction, but is the Professor of Poverty and Human Development and directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, at the University of Oxford. She has developed the Alkaya-Foster method for measuring multidimensional poverty and is leading the implementation of the MPIs with colleagues at OPHI. Warm welcome to you, Sabina. And then Yendi Moloyi is the Director of the Department of Enterprise Development in Botswana's Ministry for Entrepreneurship, driving policies and initiatives to foster inclusive economic growth, entrepreneurship, skills development, and employment creation. It's so good to have you on the panel today. Thank you for joining us. Then my colleague Angela Luzigi is our UNDP Res Rep in India, where she is leading UNDP's efforts to support India's progress towards achieving the 2030 Agenda. Angela was previously UNDP Res Rep in Ghana, where MPI work also took place. Then my good friend and colleague George Gray Molina is our UNDP Chief Economist and Director for our Inclusive Growth Team, which shapes global policy strategies to reduce poverty, promote economic inclusion, and advance sustainable development. Welcome, George. And my other colleague, Yanchun Zhang, who is our Chief Statistician at UNDP's Human Development Report Office, and oversees statistical innovations and data analysis to inform global human development policies. A warm welcome to you, Yanchun. So before we start with your questions to our panelists, I do hope you come with lots of good questions to stimulate a great discussion today. I would like to invite Gonzalo to deliver a short presentation on the handbook. So Gonzalo, firstly, let me say our word of appreciation for leading this collaborative effort between OPHI and UNDP. It would be great if you can provide a little bit of an overview of some of the key findings, lessons learned, and recommendations in the application of the MPI. How can we ensure that the MPI are not just measured, but actively used? That's the key thing. How are they actually used as a policy instrument in our planning and budgeting processes across countries? So Gonzalo, warm welcome, and back over to you.
Thank you very much, Francine. Thank you very much to all of you for being here, our guests and those who are watching from far away. And thank you for organizing this event. I think it's going to be a very interesting for those who are listening to us. I mean, as we know, technological innovations have been part of development for many years. So that includes agricultural innovations, apps for transferring money in mobile phones, water purification systems, energy efficient cookstoves, and many others. And one of these innovations is about the measurement of socioeconomic challenges. I mean, if we measure properly inflation, GDP, poverty, violence, we could understand them better and address them with better public strategies. Some of these measurements are easily adopted and used in policy. So for instance, in the health sector, I mean, the effectiveness of treatments depends heavily on, for instance, measuring blood pressure or cholesterol levels. These are key measurements which are used almost every day. However, sometimes it is not that clear that these technical innovations are adopted and used in public policy. And this is often due to insufficient policy engagement rather than technical flaws. Vaccines, for example. I mean, using vaccines, administering vaccines often involves persuading and engaging both the general public and government officials to support and implement vaccination programs. I mean, for many of us, some who are here, many people believe within countries and international institutions that poverty should be measured in a multidimensional way. I mean, the MPI is a very good option for this. We can tackle poverty better if we measure it this way. So for instance, we could use the MPI as a coordinating strategy, as the handbook says, to reduce poverty, assigning targets and objectives to different ministries, therefore to tackle different dimensions. We can do that with MPI. But one thing is having the indicator, and a different one is using it by governments. So because policy engagement is as important as the technical part, Sabina and I decided to write this handbook. The title is How to Use National MPIs as a Policy Tool and How Can We Go from Metrics to Policy. And the objective of the handbook is twofold. The first objective is to show examples of countries already using the MPI for public policy. I mean, these countries not only adopted the MPI to measure poverty, but they use it for better government. You already, Francine, gave us some examples on Colombia, Chile, Bhutan, but many other countries have done that. And the second objective of the handbook is to show ways to engage and convince key stakeholders to use this important tool. So how can we transit from being a technical researcher, building an MPI, to actually engage national stakeholders to use these technical tools? So, I mean, you already can download the book, which is in the chat. There's a link. You can look at it, and if you can see the content. I mean, the first five chapters. It's about the examples of Ghana, Nepal, Mexico, Panama, Pakistan, Colombia, Vietnam, the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, Angola, Bhutan, Costa Rica, Mozambique, in how they are using MPI for different purposes. For instance, for tracking progress. We can track progress and the evolution of poverty and its dimensions with an MPI, to use it for accountability and to use it for management, government. MPI for targeting. One of the key elements for poverty addressing is how can we target best those in poverty or extreme poverty. So Pakistan, Cambodia, Colombia, Vietnam, the state of Oaxaca have done that. How to use MPI for budget allocation. This is one of the key elements that we need to the MPI to be useful for. Not only measuring poverty, but how can we really use it for budget purposes? So you'll see various examples of countries already using the MPI. This means that these countries not only adopted MPI and thought it was a technically good tool, but they're using it. And therefore, there were champions and people actually convinced within governments that the MPI was very useful for MPI. And the second part of the handbook, Francis and friends, is about understanding different techniques or tips to engage actually with policy officials within countries. So how can we go from being a good technical researcher who produces the MPI to also have the hat of like a more political hat to convince those who you need to convince to use it and even adopt MPI. So on the second part of the book, you'll see, for instance, how can we understand the political context of that country at that moment? Who should we talk to? Who are the key powerful people or institutions we can address in order for MPI to be used? How can we communicate better? This is one of the challenges that we have being researchers. How can we translate the language of the technical language to the language of those who are making policy? And that's not an easy transition. Therefore, we need what we call knowledge brokering. Understand the technical part, but taking to a broader audience in a different language. How can we create a better narrative? So it's not only about saying, hey, this is a very important tool, these are the technical elements, but how can we make a story so many political people can use it? So the second part of the book, actually, you can use it for many other engagements for public policy. So for instance, when we are setting up national evaluation systems, we understand that this is a political challenge with technical elements, not the other way around. So we researchers need to have the ability to persuade key political stakeholders for them to adopt our innovations. And in some countries, we should be engaging with national stakeholders more than once. So for instance, one day, a government is using the MPI actively, and the next government is not using it anymore. We may need to go back again, time after time, for this tool to be used. So that's the handbook about. I just want to finish by thanking many people. I mean, we interviewed various people from countries, Mario Jose Bon, the Seychelles Islands, Risenga Maluleke, Pali Lehola, South Africa, Macarena Alvarado from Chile, Laura Pavon from Colombia, Miguel Sekeli from Mexico, many people from OFI and international institutions, help as well Michelle Mouchet, Luis Felipe Lopez Galva, Rose Jennings, Alexandra Fortcas, Corinne Michel, Ricardo Nogales, Christian Oldich, John Hammock, Adriana Conconi, Maya, Sabina, of course, a key person for this handbook. And I want to thank especially Paola Vela and Rodrigo Carvajal in Mexico, who really worked hard many months on this handbook. Thank you very much, Francine.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gonzalo. And I mean, I'm going to turn to Sabina now, but I think your key point that I took away from your sort of introduction is there's the technical aspect, but then there's the political aspect. And that's the key. That's where the magic happens, when you can find a way to convince political leaders, decision makers, not just from a technical standpoint, but from more of a political standpoint, that it makes sense to use this and apply this tool to the way they do policy making and decision making. So, and then you also mentioned something that, Sabina, you and I have discussed at least a couple of times recently, is the challenge of when you have a change in government, how to make sure that the focus and support for the MPIs stays. So it really is, as you say, a political question, and the second half of the handbook focuses on that. Now, I noticed that in the Q&A, we did get a question, and so Sabina, maybe you can touch on these examples. There was a question about Colombia and Chile, if we can get more information on those. But turning to you, it would be really nice to, I didn't want to put you on the spot there. We can answer those questions about Chile and Colombia later. But just turning to you, it would be really good to hear more about what you've learned in terms of the advantages of the MPI, and what really the successes are in terms of turning it into practice and using it on the ground. So Sabina, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francine and Gonzalo, and really for your leadership on this project. Patti Lohola, a former statistician general in South Africa, has a lovely image. And he said that it used to be that statisticians would create statistics and there would be a wall, and then they would throw them over the wall and hope that policy actors caught them. And that now it's a different era. And so statisticians must themselves understand the implications of the measures so that they can convey them a little bit better. And similarly from the other side, so there's a handoff, there's a working together, there's a sense of, okay, how can this statistic on poverty actually reach the lives of poor people, and how can it be transitioned through different layers of policy action to make that change happen? And so that requires a reinterpretation of statistic, a re-understanding in a sense of what technical people will know from one direction, but to appreciate the levers for action. And as Tony Atkinson said, how these measures are linked to action. So the first thing that I want to observe is that, as Francine said at the beginning, many of you on the call will be in among those 40-some countries, over 3 billion people now with official national MPIs reported in the SDG Global Database. And so you are perhaps already in those positions. And what the book does is it basically collects interviews from the policy entrepreneurs. And that phrase of policy entrepreneurs is Gonzalo's, and I think it really captures the need for interest, the need for a kind of ambition on behalf of the poor, and also creativity that's required to marshal statistics into action. And it offers a snapshot of country experiences in the period just after the COVID-19 pandemic. And it basically looks through interviews and studies at the steps that were taken by the policy entrepreneurs to embed and institutionalize the MPI during their terms of government as a tool for charting and guiding meaningful change. And so they can be read on the one hand as a source of ideas, as we might read some other book to sort of stimulate our own imagination, but they will be in different contexts and different times than the present. And so they are also examples of how people enacted in their own time period, something that we might need to innovate on differently in the current time period. And so that is, in a sense, an invitation to imagination, an invitation to those on this call to do things differently, to build on their generation, to do it better, to find different levers of action, to identify the gaps, and then to come back so that there can be more case studies and more South-South learning, including through the MPN that Francine mentioned. But also there's a second need, which is emerging from many of you, and that is the need for actually in-depth case studies, very technical about budgeting or about targeting and the survey questions and the mechanisms of putting them together and of data merging and so on. And so alongside the need for the energy of entrepreneurship, there's developing in another emerging literature that's again a little bit more technical, but on each of the chapters of Gonzalo's book, from targeting to budgeting to complementing monetary to evaluation, to obtaining the correct data, and to coordinating using management systems, key performance indicators, and results-based frameworks. So I think that that's an exciting development that will in time complement this work. But I think that the most important is to recognize among these policy entrepreneurs that often a commitment came first and the how-to knowledge came second. There was a commitment to try to do something for poverty, to try to use statistics, to try to use policy space, but there was uncertainty of what to do. And so a group gathered, a group tried things out, saw what worked, saw what didn't work, and moved ahead. And I think that's important in our time because there's high commitments, but there are many barriers. There are many challenges that we are facing that maybe we haven't faced in the past in this way. But knowing that a commitment can precede action and innovation and have the energy to drive it forward, I think is something that comes out through the many interviews of the many actors at different levels, from senior to junior, from well-established policy leaders to people just beginning their careers. And so the hope is that this handbook is an idea book, a seed of further action. And we look forward to seeing how you take it forward, criticize it, improve on it, bring more deep, in-depth knowledge and your own stories to it. So thank you so very much to all at UNDP, to Gonzalo, to all who were interviewed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sabina. So colleagues, you heard Sabina there say, we want your feedback, engage with it, give us your reactions, your feedback, critical, positive. It's good to use the handbook to stimulate a discussion and to further learn. And I also note another question that came in. Let's sort of look at those questions as we go. So the first question, Sabina, in case you didn't see the questions, is now being pasted in the chat, and it was just it was from a colleague who wanted to, let me just get the name right, Mahomet Arifi, who wanted to know more about the examples from Colombia and Chile. So I'm sure we'll get opportunities to talk about that. And then there was another question that just came in from Jesus Pacheco, who wanted to know whether the examples used, the country examples, were just from countries where OPHI and UNDP have worked, or does it cover other countries as well? Great. So now I'm going to go to Yendi Moloyi, which is very exciting because we're going to hear about an actual country example. And this is Botswana. So Yendi, how is Botswana using the MPI? What policy uses or plans, we're talking about the use of the MPI, so what uses and plans do you have for it in Botswana? We've also talked a lot about the need for political buy-in. Again, Sabina just reiterated that point that Gonzalo made, that you need that kind of political commitment up front, that policy space to look into it. So what strategies have worked in your country in terms of institutionalizing the MPI and getting that leadership buy-in? And what tips and recommendations do you have for other countries, other governments who are thinking of using the MPI? So thank you again, and over to you. There we go.
Thank you very much, and good day to all of you. I'll start by saying good day, simply because here in Botswana, it's late afternoon. It's around 4 p.m. So it has been a long day for me. But thank you very much for the opportunity to share the journey of Botswana's launch of MPI. Firstly, I just want to indicate that Botswana is still a novice with regard to the use of MPI. We started the use of MPI in 2020. That was the first time that we launched the MPI, and we started with the global MPI. But maybe just to indicate that maybe the events that led to Botswana adopting MPI. Back in 2018, Botswana held national poverty eradication, or not national, but international poverty eradication conference that had participants from all over the world. You know, your UNDP, your Brazil, you know, a number of countries participated. And at that conference, that is where one of the key resolutions was that MPI would help the world reduce and even eradicate poverty because of its holistic nature in approach, and also in identifying all the deprivations. So that was a key resolution that I was just indicating that Botswana started by the poverty conference, international poverty conference, where the resolution was that MPI would be very useful in guiding poverty initiatives in the country. So what then happened was that we then involved all the key stakeholders. The key stakeholders, that would be your statisticians, your local government, the NGOs, the civil society, the academians, the research institutions, and not forgetting the poor people themselves. That is very key. We involved them. Through their involvement, we were able to come up with different dimensions and indicators for the national MPI. The importance of involving the poor themselves was for us to also then recognize what their needs were. So that is how we started. Thereafter, we then engaged UNDP, who then facilitated the OFI or OPI to come and resource those key stakeholders on what MPI was. Thereafter, that's when we started now coming up with different indicators and also dimensions for the national MPI. How have we used the MPI? For us, like I'm mentioning, that we are still an amateur in the use of MPI. However, we have been able to use the MPI to target. We started with selecting one region where we were able to profile all the people in that area, and we then used the MPI to identify those households that were poor. we use the MPI, the cutoffs that we had on the MPI, to identify those people that were poor. And then after identifying those people, we then followed them up to determine the type of interventions that would meet their deprivations. So that's what we have done so far. And we are continuing to monitor those people that have been identified as poor. As we give them these interventions, like your education, some had deprivations of education, some had deprivations of housing, so different interventions were then employed to try and assist those people. So we continue measuring. We have a database that we use. We have profiled those people. So we continue to check their progress with regard to improvement in their livelihood. So that is what we are doing at the moment. But with regard to using the MPI now for budget allocation, and also for maybe informing different regions on the type of interventions that they need to do. We are still working on that. We have rounded some of the districts, started with some of the districts. We are already engaging them, trying to ensure that they understand MPI first. By the way, we are also in the planning process right now. And the MPI is one of the key measures that is being used to ensure that we allocate resources to those that require more assistance. So we have started using that process. The other thing may be just to mention that when I was mentioning the International Poverty Conference, that was led by the political leadership, by the ministers. So there is buy-in from the political leadership, and actually it is essential that you have buy-in from the political leadership. And it is important to understand that for you to get buy-in from the political leadership, you need to convince them that indeed MPI would help address the poverty problem, poverty and inequality problem. Until you do that, it may be difficult for one to get political buy-in. But the important thing is that the political leaders, they want a workable solution that would help them reduce poverty. So for us, we were able to do that, to convince the leadership. Those of you that may recall that in 2021, the then president of Botswana was among the panelists at the UNGA special meeting on multidimensional poverty. He was a panelist there. So there is indeed buy-in. Maybe just to indicate as well that you probably know that there has been a change of government in Botswana. But even with the change of government, the key priorities remain the same. Poverty eradication is still an issue. Inequality is still an issue. Therefore, the only challenge is the how part. And there is agreement that MPI is helpful in that regard because it's able to pinpoint the deprivations that each region has. And in that regard, it will help the country in tackling the various challenges that the poor are facing. Maybe just to conclude by saying that it is key for government to have stakeholder meetings that involve all the key stakeholders in the fight against poverty and inequality. That is key. For if you don't have that, it is likely to be construed as MPI as just a measure for government and not for the rest of the country. So it is important to do that. The other thing that we are doing is to have national consultative meetings where you involve the poor and explain in simple language to the poor what the MPI is. That is very key. They need to know. Once they know, then they are able also to participate willingly in the programs that are being offered to them. Because the key thing is all the programs, there has to be involvement of the poor. Nothing for us without us. I think I'll stop there. Maybe I'll end up taking too much time, but I'll stop there. If there are any more questions, I'll be happy to respond to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yendi, and I'm really glad we were able to get you back because that was a really clear outline of what you've done in Botswana, and it really just shows the power of peer-to-peer sharing between countries in South-South cooperation, as Gonzalo said at the beginning, where you can share experiences. And I think for me, the key points that I extracted that relate to today's discussion are particularly around how we use and the importance of the political buy-in. As you said, most government leaders do want to reduce poverty, but the question is how, and I'm going to turn to George after, not now, but a bit later, to ask him why is this approach better in showing that we can reduce poverty than some income-based measures. So that's one thing that you said. I think the other thing you said, which is very practical, is you started with a conference. A conference is a good way to get that kind of political buy-in and interest from a large range of different stakeholders, right? To get that excitement going. Because throughout your presentation, you really talked about the importance of this being an inclusive and not just a technical process, right? Where you would bring in different parts of government, you bring in different stakeholders as well as those in poverty. That was a second important point for me. And then the third is you took it down to the regional level first. You started at the regional level, and with that, you hope to be able to take it to other regions as well. So thank you very much for that really good example of how it can actually be used in practice. So now I'm going to turn to Angela, my colleague in India, who's got experience as an international organization, as UNDP, working on supporting countries to implement the MPI, both in India, where you are now, but previously in Ghana, where you were ResRep before. So Angela, we'd love to hear a little bit from you about what you see as the role of international organizations, and how can you explain the successes that countries like India have had in terms of being able to use the MPI and really make massive progress in reducing poverty, including multidimensional poverty? So over to you, Angela.
Thank you so much, Francine, and really, really interesting inputs from the fellow panelists and also what's going on in the chat. There's a lot of conversations. But I think the real beginning of success for a country like India and also Ghana is really that national ownership. And you've heard also the example from Yendi. You need champions, right? So you need that champion, you need that ownership, understanding why it's of value. And in the case of India, they were very clear that they wanted to have proper metrics for being able to monitor progress on some of their development indicators, sort of as an impact of the outcome of some of the programs. So we know, for example, now that the national MPI, because they actually nationalized it, so they took all the original indicators and then added some, and have consistently been able to track that over 3 time periods. But now they've actually incorporated it in the measurement of progress against the SDGs. So that is part of their national framework for monitoring the progress on SDGs, but it's also part of the SDG India Index. And that is useful because it actually breaks down and looks at localized figures, at state level and even below at district level. And it helps them to be able to direct more attention to both the SDGs that are lagging behind, but also areas that are lagging behind. So definitely that championship, that leadership is very, very important. But also, as we say in UNDP, the process is as important as the outcome. One of the things that the MPI, as was mentioned, institutionalizing it, means that there's conversations happening across sectors. And when we're looking at development as a whole, that part of institutionalizing the process and having an interministerial committee working with the state level representatives is really a critical and useful outcome going forward. And just beyond looking at the champions and the ownership, it's actually the utilization, right? The stories behind the numbers. So it's one thing to have an index, but very much working with the academicians and other stakeholders to be able to understand the story behind the index. And one of the questions that was in the chat also was really looking at how, is that the singular measure? How can we include other indicators? And then I'll go to the example from Ghana, because Ghana has actually taken the data and really been able to visualize it at the hyper-local level and used it in conjunction with other indicators of development so that you're able to look at variables beyond what is included in the index and use that interaction to be able to guide policy. So I think those kinds of things are really important. But going forward, this is an evolving index, and most countries have internalized it and been able to adjust it to their circumstances. And as Sabine mentioned, you start with the data that you have, right? Data is never perfect. You start with what you have, you're consistent, and engaging with the index will also help you to improve some of the data collection systems. And that is what is happening, has happened in Ghana and is happening elsewhere. But looking to the future, it's an ongoing conversation. And I think the most important thing is that ownership. It's building that cadre of people who can transcend even changes in government. And the network, for example, of or the MPI network is a good example of how we're able to animate those champions and how we're able to build that capacity even at the local level and the subnational level. So I'll end with that because it's very important to have that capability from the advocacy side, from the measurement side, but also communicating in a way that policymakers are able to understand how the index can be used.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. That's really important. And I think you emphasized the importance of this being an ongoing conversation. It's not just done and then finished. The work needs to be ongoing and a continual process. So now I'm moving on to George. George, this question's coming up. Why is the MPI useful, perhaps as a complement? That's the best word to use, as a complement to income-based measures. How can, to continue the discussion that we're having, the MPI help persuade political leaders and decision makers that it is a useful tool to reduce poverty? And what do you see as the greatest barriers to adopting the MPI in policy making, and how can we kind of overcome some of these barriers? So, George, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Francine. Let me just start by thanking Gonzalo for this fantastic handbook. Also, Sabina, Niendi, Angela, Yanchun for your insights. I think all of this is important. Everyone on the call is either a practitioner or a researcher or someone involved in this agenda. So together we can make sense of this. Maybe I can focus on 3 points that have to do with this value added and some of the obstacles, but also the drivers and enablers. I think the first is just to underline that the MPIs have sharpened evidence-based policymaking, making that connection between data and services more visible. And we know that this has been going for a while now. I really like the quote in the handbook and the focus that says, good evidence is great, but it should be part of government's daily decisions if we want tangible results on poverty or broadly on development. So I think the MPIs really did turbocharge our awareness of how deprivations relate to each other, how we track them, how we measure and contrast poverty metrics, and I would argue in a more fine-grained manner than income-based metrics. However, there's also the subjective, the cultural, the political conversation behind MPIs, which is very important. So the maps and the data are what John Scott called seeing like a state. But there's also seeing like the stakeholders, seeing like the household, seeing like the communities on the ground who exercise agency and choice. And I think that interchange between the data and the maps, but also how people visualize their choices and how they express them is very important. And that I think our previous panelists have mentioned some of that. Just to end on this first point, I think our generation of policymakers has often missed some of the learnings and lessons from an earlier generation of policymakers on multidimensional interventions, such as rural integrated development programs in the 1980s or basic needs programs in the 1970s. UNDP and UN agencies were very much involved in these, and I think there's important lessons from what we learned from that agenda. Second, I think that when we turn to enablers of MPI adoption, I think that the geographic, territorial nature of intervention sets the stage either for targeted or comprehensive interventions. And this geographic, territorial nature, when we add it to a digital revolution, really gets started. So we see digital social registries, digital IDs, digital apps that track service provision. And MPI implementation harnesses dozens of overlapping maps for each household, neighborhood, or community. So what used to be a set of metrics now becomes like a Google Maps of policy making. And I think that red, green, yellow map of poverty hotspots can be tracked over time across weather shocks, through economic downturns. It gives us a closer view of what MPI adoption entails. Maybe just a third point is that I think a critical obstacle to MPI adoption has to do with the fiscal side, and it's common to our challenge on funding care economies and other issues on social protection. Now, not every service provided towards multidimensional poverty will be public. Most, in fact, will run through MSMEs, communities, and private initiatives. However, what is public is the underlying architecture. And the capacity to extend or wind up MPI interventions is public through and through. In my mind, I think just thinking back over the past 5 years, it's not so much the cash transfer modality, which was based on rolling out existing resources until they run out, but rather more of the financing of water systems, of electrification systems, of housing improvement modalities, which require capital investments up front, but then become a maintenance operation. So it's a different kind of fiscal challenge with the MPI, and it's a longer term challenge for all of us. The use of MPIs for better budgeting allocation is critical, and it's part of this process. And I think the case studies described in the handbook for Angola, Bhutan, Costa Rica, Mozambique are very illuminating and important. I think it sets the stage for optimized use of overlapping interventions, which is what fine-grained tool like the MPI can capture. Let me stop here. I'm sure we can get back to other issues. Back to you, Francine.
Thanks, George. Thanks a lot. And thank you for making the connections with other kind of development terrain, right? So the link with the enablers working at the local level through integrated solutions, linking with digital and how digital can be a really an accelerator for reducing poverty. And then on some of the constraints, the fiscal, how we can attract investment and financing for poverty reduction. Excellent. And now the last speaker, and colleagues, I'm loving all these really good questions that are coming in on links with nature and all these other questions that are coming in. And I can see that our panel is working hard to answer all these questions. So thanks for that. Please keep an eye on the chat if you can while you're listening to the panelists. So I'm going to go to our last speaker now, Yan-Chun, our chief statistician, really to ask you the question, how do you see, Yan-Chun, the global and the national MPIs complementing each other? And what innovations are you seeing from where you sit in using MPIs for policy formulation and implementation? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Francine. I apologize for my voice. I caught cold over the weekend. I wish all you good health. It's a great pleasure to join the panel today. Then first, I want to congratulate Gonzalo and Ofi and UNDP colleagues for producing such a great report. Then, since I'm working with Sabina and her team in mainly producing the global MPI report, so my brief intervention today will focus on how global MPI and national MPI and regional MPI complement each other. So let me first by saying it's a rapidly changing landscape of multidimensional poverty measurement in terms of both global significance as well as crucial national adaptations. Then the growing recognition poverty is more than just a lack of income has been widely accepted. Then you can see this expansion of multidimensional poverty indices reshaping policies, research, but also development strategies worldwide. Now, at the heart of this effort is the global MPI. That's what we at HDRO jointly produce with OFI every year. Then this is based on robust and methodological rigorous model and provides internationally comparable estimates for multidimensional poverty. Then since 2018, we jointly produce these estimates and publish the global MPI report every year. Now, similar to the HDI, our Human Development Index, MPI is also a capabilities-based measure. The HDI tracks a country's overall progress in expanding basic capabilities. The MPI identifies multiple simultaneous deprivations experienced by individuals. So the strength of the global MPI lies in its comparability, providing a consistent benchmark for you to track global progress, also highlighting disparities between and within countries and drive evidence-based policymaking for poverty reduction. However, while comparability is essential, it is not sufficient for national policymaking. So poverty is deeply context-specific. Its nature and experience vary dramatically between countries. So that's why for poverty reduction to be effective, measurements must be meaningful and relevant at the national and regional levels. That is why national MPIs are essential, even though we are not directly involved in providing support to national MPI, but we are very, very excited to see national MPI has been mushroomed. So we see this national MPI take the strong methodological backbone of the global MPI, then adapt it to each country's unique context, adjusting dimensions, indicators, weights to reflect national priorities, local realities, also policy needs. Similarly, regional MPIs help tailor policies across diverse cultural and economic landscapes within and between countries. So my main point today is now I think with all this rapid development, it is even more important to emphasize, to invite more governments, organizations, and researchers to join the MPI movement to adopt, adapt, and expand with open-minded and with open heart. So this multidimensional poverty measure can have a real impact on the ground, but it needs to be based on rigorous policy, relevant and actionable analysis. Then the more countries, policymakers, and communities embrace this approach, then the greater its impact will be. Last, I will say the shift from a single income lens to multidimensional perspective represent a fundamental transformation in the way we understand and fight poverty. Then this should absolutely continue. Then UNDP has a very important role to play jointly with our partners like OFI. Thank you. I will stop here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Yan-Chun. So, colleagues, we have 10 minutes left, and I see that our panelists have been answering some of the questions. Maybe what I will do, because you've reviewed the questions, is just turn to you one by one in turn if you'd like to say something, reflecting on the questions that you've been answering. So if I may just do that, if you don't want to speak, then that's also fine. But let me go back in the order that we had the panelists. So first, Gonzalo, just 1 minute from you, please. Some reflections from the Q&A that you're seeing in the chat that's happening. Over to you.
It was a very rich set of questions. It was difficult for me to answer many of them, and at the same time listening to what my colleagues and friends were saying, and I'm very happy with the reaction. I'm sure that if we engage further, Francine, we can answer some of these questions that got an answer on the chat. So I just recommend my friends to just get the handbook, which is already there in the UNDP webpage. We want to thank the UNDP for doing this. And even in the handbook, you can click and see videos of the people we interviewed. So it's like an interactive handbook. And it's not only text, it's the videos as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks. So, Gonzalo, you sound overwhelmed by all the wealth of the questions, but colleagues, that's a good thing. I think it shows the demand and the level of interest in this. And so, we can continue answering the questions after the session finishes, and we can also post the Q&A on Spark Blue afterwards. And send it out with the briefing, so colleagues have time to answer, and you also have time to digest those answers. So we will do that. Thank you very much, Gonzalo. And now Sabina.
In that case, sorry for all my typos. I think what I would like to observe is that many questions were asked about targeting, either about the use of censuses to create very localized understandings of poverty, or of social registries that are used to target households that are poor. And in my mind, this is one of three big, very fast growing areas. And Angola, Vietnam, Colombia, Mexico, Bhutan, so many countries in all regions do create an MPI from their national population and housing census. And so if you haven't done that yet, it won't be perfect. You won't have undernutrition there. But insofar as you can proxy a core of MPI questions and maybe add 1 or 2 questions to the next census, you're able to get a really local level that then you can share with local actors. And they always want to know how they are vis-a-vis their neighbors. So it's a very good tool. Look at Ghana's statistical offices that Angela said had 261 reports for local actors in simple language with lots of graphics. And the second is targeting. This is an area many governments are exploring, targeting the MPI poor, doing a proxy of the national MPI from their social registry data. And often, increasingly, they are able to merge some kind of health records data, anemia data, with other data. And so this is, again, a very fast-moving area that we are deeply engaged in and want to learn from you as you explore it further.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sabina. And absolutely, we don't mind typos at all. Just good to get your feedback and your answers. Okay, now Yengi, please. Final thoughts.
Thank you very much. I think for me, really the key message would be that more maybe that I want to relay to you is the situation in Botswana, how we develop the MPI questionnaire for the survey. Statistics Botswana, or our Statistics Bureau, it involves all the key stakeholders, particularly the ones that deal with or that implement poverty eradication programs, and even the coordination agency, poverty coordination agency, is involved in the development of those questionnaires, those indicators. I think that helps a lot in terms of now the acceptance of the results when they are produced. I think I'll stop there thus far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your time today after such a long day. Angela.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francine. So 3 quick points. A lot has been said about the changing face of poverty. And while we do have the core dimensions, health, education, and living standards, it's now interacting with more with inequality and new gaps when it comes to access to technology, for instance. And we have to find ways in our national MPIs to be able to integrate, some of these gaps and some of these inequalities and see who is being left behind and why, and being able to really break it down is helpful. And one of the things around the new data also, with the advent of technology, we have more citizen generator. So in a way, we can complement what's coming out of the national MPIs by also looking at more real-time data and being able to reflect some of, like, for instance, there are mobile apps where people can report whether there's, lights and and so on, so that you can get a more detailed understanding of what the social infrastructure is, for example, in informal settlements. So there's a lot going into the future where we're getting more and more detailed and real-time data that we can look at. And also looking to the future as some of our static indicators interact with the variability. For instance, we might actually have to start looking at ranges, so you have a particular figure, and then you can interact with, a hazard like climate change and so on, so that you can come up with probabilities of some certain figure. So there's a lot of exciting work that's out there as we get more and more data, and as we get a more and deeper understanding of the story behind the national MPIs.
Thank you very much, Angela. And thank you for emphasizing at the end there that the dynamic nature of poverty and how it's constantly changing, and we need tools that can adapt to that too. Great. George.
Just very briefly, just to plug again the handbook, because you'll see the conversational style and sort of the policy use logic that Gonzalo and team have put together. And I think if we just follow that index, the contents, it's a fantastic roadmap of how a policymaker is thinking about MPI implementation. And of course, on the metric side, I think we've learned a lot over the past decade. Not everything has to be packed inside the MPI. There is also a dashboard of other metrics, contextual, regional, national, even international, that are part of this conversation, but don't have to be necessarily inside an MPI. So I just wanted to say that, because there's a lot of interest in other dimensions and other aspects that are correlated, of course, to poverty reduction over time. Thank you.
Brilliant, George. Thank you. And Yanchun.
Very briefly as well, I just want to say, even our work here is focusing on global MPI, but we learn a lot from a national MPI work as well. So I have shared the handbook with my team as well. So Sabina has been working on both global MPI and national MPI. Our office is mainly focused on global MPI, but what's going on the national front give us a lot of ideas. So going forward, definitely we can use this very valuable feedback to look at our global MPI methodology. So that's the last point I want to make. The definition, the measurement, the methodology, dimensions, indicators, cutoffs, all this, we shall make them flexible. even though for global MPI, we have the methodology has been settled for a while, but going forward, we have to adapt to what's going on. For example, these digital deprivations. A lot of individuals are currently experiencing. Also, over time, OFI and UNDP have been discussing how to bring the report more close to the current affairs, let's put that way. So our last 2024 Global MPI report focused on conflict and poverty. I invite colleagues who haven't looked at it, take a look. It's available on the office website and the HDRO's website. Stop here. Thank you, Francine.
Thank you, Yanchun. If you have time, just quickly share the link in the chat if you can. So let me just take 30 seconds to wrap up for today. So firstly, big thank you to our panelists. A big thank you to Gonzalo and Sabina, our partners at OPHI, for this really excellent collaboration. To our guests, Yenge, Angela, I know it's late for you both, so thank you for staying with us. And I think this handbook is really a treasure trove of country experiences, which is the best way for countries to learn from each other. So please do take a look, and Sabina's provocation, do give us feedback, positive, negative, we want to hear from you. So two sort of overall thoughts from my side. The first one is, on this question of how do we ensure that it's used? I think the key point is we need to look for political opportunity. There needs to be a political opportunity. There needs to be a space for a policy discussion at the outset. And I really liked this idea of a policy entrepreneur that Sabina, you mentioned. It's not enough just to be a technical statistician expert now. We really need to look at how to apply and where those opportunities, those openings are for change. So that's really number one. And then in relation to that, I would just flag that we do have a social summit at the end of this year, right? Which is a good political opportunity for us globally. And so the question is, how do countries really prepare now at the beginning of 2025 to really position and get the most out of that social summit at the end of the year in Qatar in November? Then the second, I think, important point that many of the panelists made today was the importance of partnership, consultation, and taking an integrated approach. Taking integrated approaches to the challenges that we face in the world around us is essential today, because the world is changing, it's so complex, and we need those integrated approaches. And the MPI potentially offers that integrated approach, not only in terms of bringing together issues and understanding the multidimensional nature of deprivations, but also the importance of working together across ministries, across stakeholders, and having that dialogue and discussion about how to address. And I think we heard in the questions and in the answers the importance of linking with the financial, the fiscal discussion, the importance of linking with other issues I saw in the questions around gender, around nature, around climate change, and the importance of harnessing digital and real-time data and these other kind of opportunities as enablers for accelerating poverty alleviation. So that to me is the second real takeaway, is that the MPI really encourages that integrated way of looking at things that is so essential today. So colleagues, everyone, thank you so much for listening in, and we will share the recording and the Q&A. Thank you, panelists, for not only speaking, but writing quickly as well. And audience, thank you so much for all your brilliant questions, and please stay tuned. We'll continue this discussion. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.